Hello, and welcome to the Faith and Works podcast. If you have listened to, or in fact, maybe seen a few of our podcasts where we did a video recording, not all of them, you know that we try to pick a theme. We have often start our podcasts with a question. We are the sponsor, that is, of the podcast, Faith and Works, is a production of the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. And so if you think of us as interfaith, that's fine, but also think of us as an organization that honors values, the values of people who have faith, certainly, but also those people who would claim to be independent from a faith experience. We see their values as important also. And so in this podcast, we are starting a series that is in response to the question, what is sacred in our world today? I think it's a really interesting question. The whole idea of sacredness, we do use that word quite readily. And in faith experience, of course, we have rituals and ritual space and worship space that we consider sacred and so on. But we also use the word sacred quite widely. And there are many areas where we could explore what is sacred in our world today. The one we want to talk about right now is the idea of children. Are our children sacred today? I think there's some evidence that would make us question that. And so I've invited a person who has some experience in the area of psychology to be along with me. And I'm Bob Brutel. I happen to be the vice chair of the Interfaith Leadership Council. I am also an adjunct professor of religious studies and history at the University of Detroit Mercy. I'm retired and spending as much time as I did when I had professional involvement working with the Interfaith movement or the Interfaith Leadership Council these days, and find it quite fulfilling. Along with me, I have Dr. Saba Maroof, who is a psychotherapist who deals with children. And so when I was asking some of my friends whom they would recommend to talk on this subject of children and what they mean to us today, and whether the word sacred is meaningful in that respect, I am happy to have Dr. Maroof with me as a professional in that area. Dr. Maroof, what else would you say about your practice, and you as a person that would help our audience know what you are bringing with you in terms of your professional ability and also your lived experience for our discussion right now?
Thank you so much, Bob. First of all, it's an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much for extending the invitation to have this conversation with you. I'm really excited to be here. So actually, I do therapy as well, but I'm a psychiatrist. So, which kind of leads me to this whole, when I was starting my professional career in college, I had to I had to make that decision. Do I want to take the route of getting a PhD in psychology, or do I want to go to medical school and pursue, being a psychiatrist? But I did know pretty early on that I wanted to go further in my studies and specialize in child and adolescent psychiatry. So I am a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, and I see the whole lifespan, and it's kind of one of the only fields in medicine, especially as we're getting so specialized these days. It's one of the only fields where you can see all ages, actually, which I really enjoy. I don't have my own practice at this time. I'm kind of an independent contractor, but I've been working now for about 10 years out after my training. But I've been practicing psychiatry since 2008. And it's one of the things that I really love about my job is working with, as I mentioned, all across the lifespan, seeing all age groups, and particularly working with families. And I think it's actually been an interesting journey as I was starting my training, and as a medical student and then a resident, I started having kids in medical school. My firstborn was born my last year of medical school, and then I had one in residency and then one in fellowship. And then when I was all done and working, professionally as a psychiatrist in the workforce. So, and it's just been very interesting because I remember the days where I was a student and I was trying to figure out what I had an idea of what I wanted to do, but still trying to hone in on that. And I was doing my psychiatry rotations, and I remember sitting in with, part of a lot of what you do in medicine is observing kind of the child psychiatrists in training with teenagers. And I felt like I could relate so much with them, and it didn't feel like I was so far away from that experience. And now these days, I feel like I relate so much to the parents. And so in that sense, I do feel, people ask me all the time, does being a child psychiatrist help, you be a better parent? And they probably ask my husband that too. And I would probably gather to say that he would probably say no. He's a very patient parent, and a lot of times he does a much better job in the parenting realm. But I think for me, being a parent, I think makes me a better and more informed, nuanced psychiatrist. Like I feel like it's one thing to give, to advise or guide people, but until you've kind of, personally, walked in those shoes and kind of understand the day to day, it's easy to kind of say, oh, well, you should have a routine and you should put your electronics away a half hour before bedtime. And when you're dealing with those same issues on the ground with your own kids, and you kind of can have a little bit more, I think, empathy as you're working with kids and parents. So as I mentioned, so I'm a psychiatrist, and I also have my own children, 4 kids that whose ages range from my oldest will be 16 next month to the youngest is 7. And she's just finishing up first grade. So I have first grader, 4th grader, 7th grader, and a 10th grader finishing up the school year. So, and again, I feel like that kind of, it's, definitely gives me a different perspective and kind of more of a nuanced, I think, worldview as I'm working with families.
Yeah, so I'm quite certain of that. We all know that we get advice from people all the time who tell us exactly what our kids should or shouldn't be doing. And they forget that our kids are also telling us exactly what they should or shouldn't be doing.
And more so the older they get.
Right. So you've got a son that's probably got a permit now to drive, and is causing you and your husband great anxiety. Is he driving on his own yet, or is he driving only with parents so far?
With parents, but I'm actually surprised that actually one thing I've noticed is that as I was growing up, we wanted to get our license right when we turned 16. And I've noticed even with the kids that I see, there's a lot more hesitancy, some anxiety. I know it used to be a simple process. Now there's so many steps to getting a license. So I wasn't sure if he was going to be on top of it. And really, I was like, okay, well, maybe we can wait till he's 17 or 18, but nope, he's actually made it a goal. He's like, no, I want to get my license at 16. And I was like, oh, okay. So he's ready to drive on his own, but we still need to do some driving. And that's the interesting thing too, was as parents, my husband is very calm. I think we had to pick up, my parents live out of state. And one day they had to pick them up from the airport. And I couldn't believe it. It was pretty soon after he got his permit, my husband let him drive to the airport. And I was like, luckily I was not in the car, but I'm the anxious parent in that scenario. He's very calm. And if I see something, or I'm like, please don't do, I'm going to say it. I'm not going to like try to be gentle. So he's like, Mom, you're making me more anxious. And it's funny because I remember being in the exact same position with my own mom. So it all comes back around full circle.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of anxiety that surrounds being a parent. My children are all adults, and we have 4 grandchildren, and those grandchildren are so special to us, and we probably do a better job of responding to their needs as grandchildren than we did in responding to the needs of our children. I'm not sure why that is. We have a little more time, I suppose. We don't feel like the whole responsibility of disciplining them and helping them to be responsible adults is on us. In fact, we think maybe the opposite is true. Our job is to not discipline them and to help them have some freedom that their parents might not allow. So, send them back to their parents and let the kids complain to us about how we're spoiling them. But you can tell from what you've said so far and what I've said so far is that we both feel very responsible to children, to what it means to have children, what it means to nurture children. They are very important to you and to me, and kind of amazing beings, right? They just they just teach us so much. They teach us how to deal with the current or the present, right? I mean, we are kind of habituated to the kinds of patterns that we grew up with, right? And our kids say, no, you don't do that, you do this, right? They bring us into the future in some ways. And so they I think in a sense they have a responsibility that we don't even recognize, that they're supposed to be bringing us along, educating us at the same time as we think that we have this primary responsibility for educating them. It brings me to talk about this tone that we've established. I think both of us, this feeling of how important children are and what they mean to us, brings me right to the subject that we wanted to talk about today, and that is, are our children sacred in the world today? And put another way, is it different to say that our children are a sacred responsibility? Are we taking that sacred responsibility serious, in a serious way? So I'm wondering if, I'm sure people do not see you in an audio podcast, but I am looking at you, Dr. Maroof, and you're wearing hijab, and so of course we know that you are an observant Muslim. I'm wondering how your faith looks at children. What do you think you bring from your faith into this idea of the sacredness of children?
Well, I think, there's so much to say. I think, of course, it starts from, thinking just about humankind and where we all come from, kind of the story of creation, and that as human beings, we know human beings are sacred. And I know that this is, similar, kind of the creation story, I believe, is similar in the monotheistic faiths, that we are special in the sense that God asked, the angels, which, in Islam, they're made of something different. Human beings are made of, kind of the soil or clay, it's described as, whereas angels were made of light. And, but yet still, when after God kind of created us and we had our soul, that he asked the angels to bow down to the first human, which was Adam, peace be upon him. And I think, I mean, kind of all starts from there, that what was so special about us, especially if we were made from something that's of the earth? Why did God, ask the angels to do that? And as I've heard and studied, it really, I think there's that, what makes us sacred? And there's something special. And I think many would agree it's kind of like our will, and the fact that we make choices that kind of, why did God create us? It kind of goes down to back to that creation story. Now I'm an observant Muslim. I'm not a scholar. I'm not, in that sense, but I guess, kind of that's my understanding. That's kind of, and it kind of, and if you're looking even at kind of ethics, we have autonomy, and that's a really big theme, even raising children, as a parent, as a physician, that we have to respect each other's autonomy and everybody's right to make choices, and that basically to make choices and to live the life that they're going to live. I think it kind of comes down to that. So their children in essence are sacred. They're born innocent. That's another theme in Islam, is that every baby is born as an innocent being. I mentioned that I have teenagers, but I have younger kids, and actually my brother just had his fourth baby. Him and his wife had their fourth baby last night. So I have a new baby nephew too. And it was just funny because I was just thinking about it. And I'm, as I have older kids, I'm just reminiscing on just like that stage when I was a first time mom and having young kids. And of course, everyone tells you it's going to go by so fast and enjoy it, and you don't really realize it until it does. But I'm missing that stage. But just that innocence, that zest for life, that enthusiasm. Of course, it's so physically taxing and grueling to take care of another being and all their physical needs, but then just, that they need you, that they're dependent on you, that they will just rest their head and just like lie on you. And sometimes, I know my oldest, I would put him down and he would wake up right away. So I just, but at least I could take him with me. Today I had a big argument with him because we needed to go somewhere, and he made us late. And I was just thinking, gosh, I remember those days I could just stick him in the car seat and carry him where I needed to take him. But so in our faith, children are born pure, they're born innocent. And we have this idea of what we call a fitra, Fitrah is a transliteration. And that's kind of like everybody's essential kind of being. Everybody's kind of born with their fitra. Actually, I was thinking about my brother. I was talking to my dad about him because he's an amazing dad, an amazing husband and son and brother, very caring. Just does so much for his family. And I was like, you telling my parents, like, you guys did an amazing job raising him. But I also think it was kind of his nature too. He's always been a very soft person, like very, like doesn't talk too much, not a lot of fanfare, but very, just does the work and very soft hearted. And I was just kind of thinking that's, of course, to my parents' credit, but also, again, that was kind of part of his fitra. And we believe that all children, part of that essence is that they want to recognize, and everybody basically leans towards recognizing and worshiping one God. That's kind of our belief. So I guess in that sense, that is what every child is born with, that innocence. And that might be kind of what I guess we would define as sacred, that every being is born with that inside them. And as they go through this world and through the trials and challenges and the choices that we make, sometimes we falter, but we're always kind of turning back towards God. And that's why it's always, it's a huge, we're encouraged, even, we just finished Ramadan about a month and a half ago. Like, we're constantly always encouraged to ask for forgiveness for things that we do, that we realize, and what we realize, not what the things that we don't realize that we're doing even. So that, and though the word in Arabic is thoba, which means, I believe, like turning back to God. So those are all very sacred concepts. And then I really like that you brought up this point of having a sacred responsibility. It kind of goes hand in hand. If we believe that all of us are sacred, our children are sacred, then yes, it is a sacred responsibility that we have as parents, to take care of our children. And it's very interesting seeing the dynamics, watching other parents raise their kids, and reflecting on my own parenting journey and being a parent. What does that mean? Dealing with the frustration of like wanting your kids to do something and them pushing back and exercising and flexing their own autonomy. They have a right to make a choice. And sometimes we cannot force them to do what we want them to do. We can't force them to be who we want them to be, but we can just instill values and ideas. And when they're young enough, and as we're raising them, to take, I guess, every opportunity to kind of talk with them and also show them what every family has kind of their own mission statement or their set of values, informed maybe by faith or maybe not, or maybe this belief in, kind of the greater good and doing things for humanity and being a good person, all of those things, all of those values. And we talk to our kids about it, and we also try to show them through our actions too. And that's kind of as much as we can do. I was actually at a lecture yesterday. I'm taking like a summer class. And now now that my kids are a little older, I feel like I can finally do some things for myself too, where like not, as you kind of mentioned, not necessarily professionally related, but kind of going back and taking classes, dealing with different religious topics. And one of the speakers was basically saying, like, if your child does not take on the same faith as you or doesn't have the same values, does that mean that you failed as a parent? And that's a kind of an interesting question, and something that many parents, I think, might feel really deeply. I know that when personally speaking, if my kids do something or if they, something doesn't come out right, as ideally as we would like a situation, kind of feel like, oh, should I have done better? Should I have reminded him? Should I have done this? We kind of blame ourselves, but they have to make their own mistakes. And what basically the scholar was saying too, that does not make us a failure as a parent. Our job is to guide and to teach and to instill as much as we can. And we give them the tools, but ultimately they're human beings and they have their own choices, and they're going to make their own mistakes, and they're going to come back and fix those mistakes or go on their own journey, and kind of back and forth. So I thought that was really interesting. And even when we're kind of, disciplining or teaching them, how do we manage kind of our own emotions? This kind of comes into the professional in me, I guess. The parenting changes as your kids get older, and we're also the adults. So we also have to model for them how to act and respond when we're upset. So if we're having a temper tantrum because they're not listening, then we're not really doing a good job modeling the behavior. We have to remember that we're the adults in the room. And so that's something I'm kind of always reminding myself, because I can be hot-headed as many other, I guess, parents can be, in the heat of the moment. You had to model for them to take deep breaths, and you can't always control what other people do, but you can control your response and how you deal with the situation. So, and actually there's a nice, there's also this whole discussion kind of reminded me of a quote too. This is, so we have, of course, quotes and collections of stories and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And we also have, sometimes we also have quotes of the very close companions. One of them being Ali, his nephew, and then the fourth caliph too. I'm sorry, his cousin and the fourth caliph. But do not raise, with something that he said, and I know my husband kind of always remembers this and reminds me of this. Do not raise your children the way your parents raised you. They were born for a different time. And especially now these days when, speaking of giving advice, when we're reminiscing, it's interesting, right? All these shows that are coming out that are set in the 80s, that's when I grew up. And we're just talking about how complicated life has gotten with our devices and with having like these in our hands all the time. And the discussion, it comes to, when do you get your child a phone? And then once even if you've like waited, we waited as long as we could, 7th grade, end of 7th grade. Once you give it to them, it's like a whole new world. And, sometimes it's very frustrating, and we just want to just go back, turn the hands of the clock and just go back to a time that just seems simpler to us, which is a very simplified way of looking at things, and just take it away or just cut it off, or but these are here to stay. So I can't use the same way that I was brought up and grown up without electronics, without devices or the internet, and use, I mean, it's just a totally different world, as an example. So that kind of reminds me of that quote.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that we can do here is contrast a little bit. Not sure if there is any contrast actually, but as I thought about the Christian way of thinking about children, we have this ceremony early on in a child's life that's called baptism. Not all of the Christian faiths do it, baptize babies, but I'm a Catholic, and Catholics do baptize babies. And we specifically give the child godparents, alternate parents, right? That are supposed to step in if they need to, but also be another way that children would be encouraged to become godly. And the idea of children being godly, I think, is from the notion that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. There's a Latin phrase for that that's called imago Dei. They have the image of God, and they are, in their innocence especially, they are beings that are representing to us what we need to care for and how we need to care for these young beings, these innocent beings, who, at an early age will start to tell us that they don't need us. And we know that's not true, right? We know that it's that they really do need us, but they need their space also. They need to be able to make some of their own choices from very early ages. And in my experience, I'm not surprised that the Catholic Church has First Communion at 7 and 8 years old, because it seems to me that in raising the children that I've had in my life, that 8 years old is a time when they start to really come into their own as far as negotiating with you, telling you what they like and what they don't like. Sometimes actually saying, well, if I do this, will you do that? And understanding that there's that they've got some agency in their own world, that they can negotiate a way to make things happen in the way that they would like them to happen. There is a sense that up until maybe 18, maybe even you could tell me something about brain development. My tendency is to think that we should be honoring adolescence up for young men, at least until they're about 25, because their brains are not fully developed. I don't know why we've come to an understanding somehow that 21 or 18 is sufficient, because it's pretty evident. I used to run a construction company where I had lots of men, and I noticed significant differences when the men in my company would attain an age of 24, 25, 26, in terms of their seriousness, in terms of their view of what their future should look like, and so on. So in any event, there's a developmental process that we need to, as parents and other adults surrounding them, we need to honor it. And I think that like I said, the Christian understanding is that these children but certainly these young children that are put into our care, they are made in the image and likeness of God. They have the essence of God. We often call that soul. It's something, it's soul or spirit or something that is ineffable. It can't be carefully defined, but we know that there's something there in a life force that comes forth out of these children, and we feel it. I mean, we actually feel that spirit from those children. We can feel that, we can see how that spirit is expressed differently from one child to the next, even though they have, supposedly they have the same sets of genes that the other children have, but somehow they express themselves so differently as human beings. And our role is to try to figure out how to honor that expression in some way, to guide it so that it finds itself in providing some sort of fruit for themselves and for society. So I like the way you put it, and I think that it's an interesting that we use some different terms, I suppose, to express it. I was wondering, as you spoke and as I was thinking of the idea of godparents, is there a sense of godparents in Islam?
Not that I know of, but as you're mentioning it, that's just such a beautiful concept. And I remember growing up with friends and they would mention that, like, oh, these are my godparents are visiting, or this is my godparent. And I always was like, oh, very curious and fascinated by the concept. I guess we don't have like defined, somebody defined as a godmother or godfather. But definitely I would say it kind of speaks to this idea that's, that's really kind of common to many cultures around the world, that, it takes a village. And so that's what's really interesting about godparents, because it's like, it's basically encouraging the family, the parents. It's a helpful concept for the parent and the child, right? So you have somebody else there to kind of help you when things are tough, when you're not really sure how to get out of a certain situation. You have somebody else that can help guide you. And I imagine godparents oftentimes are maybe more experienced, sometimes older than the parents, maybe not, but somebody else. Obviously it's somebody that you as a parent, you're designating, so you trust them, you trust their judgment, somebody that's that has some wisdom. Maybe they're older than you, maybe they're not. But I guess it kind of speaks to, the idea that it takes a village, and that, yes, you have the parent-child relationship, but it's so important to have that village, to have the grandparents and the uncles and the aunts and all those people that are around you. And especially, again, as kids are growing, they have their parents there to help guide them. But as we know, you get to certain ages where it's like sometimes they listen in a different way to a special aunt that they have a relationship with, or, even beyond that, like special, interestingly, I think in our communities now, of course, not all Muslims are immigrants, not all, but that in the immigrant community, like we have many families that kind of came around the same time and whose parents are friends. And so we're friends with their, it's kind of like intergenerational. I've got very close friends our parents knew each other back in India or Pakistan, and now we're friends here. We've kind of continued that. And they're literally, like, some of them, we even use the same terms for aunt and uncle, not just aunt and uncle, but like khala, like means mother's sister. I've got a few very close friends. My kids call their mom's khala, which means mom's sister. And so, they're kind of, and they're very integral parts of their lives too. And we ask them, my friends that have kids that are a little bit older, I'm constantly asking them for their advice, or how did you handle this situation, or what do you do in this, so kind of maybe a similar idea. And actually the other thing that I think was interesting as you were speaking was talking about the communion around age 7 or 8. That's really interesting. There's a few things that are, I can think of a few parallels. One, this is kind of more of a cultural celebration, but we actually have kind of a celebration that's around that age too. Well, I guess some people do it kind of younger. There's not like a set age for it, but it's around, 5 to 7, basically cultural celebration of when kids start to read the Quran, start learning how to read the Arabic text, the holy text. And we have a huge emphasis on reading the pure word, like reading the actual Arabic text. So even though I'm not a native Arabic speaker, it was really important religiously, culturally, as in my family, that actually my grandfather taught me how to read Quran. So again, I don't speak Arabic, but I can, and it's not unusual, I can read Arabic text.
Mhm.
And so when kids start to learn how to read, and they kind of they start on this journey of reading the text from beginning to end, and that can take, a few years. Um, it's oftentimes there's this is more cultural. This is kind of more of a South Asian culture tradition. We call it a Bismillah, which is the word, in the name of God. We start anything that we do, but particularly when we start reading the Quran or surah, then we'll say Bismillah. And that party, it's kind of a party. It's a ceremony called a Bismillah ceremony, and a party. You invite people and have food and everything and dress up. And that's around that age, actually. So it's kind of interesting that it kind of parallels a communion. Some people start a little bit early. I was lucky because I lived with speaking of the village, I was lucky enough that my grandparents lived with us for a few years. And so I learned from my grandfather. And so because he was retired and at home with us, he could work on it with me every day. And so I finished it quite early. And then you have another party. And some people just do one or the other because it's a lot of parties, but another ceremony called an Amin. Even if you don't have a party, you're commemorating it. It's a big deal. Like you'll get a cake and, what do you want for finishing the Quran? You make it a really big deal because it is a big deal to finish our holy book in a different language. Even if you speak Arabic, it's a different type of dialect. It's a different skill set in a sense to read the holy book from the beginning to the end. And it takes several months, some years sometimes, and we commemorate the end of it with an Amin. So some kids finish it early, like they might actually be 7 or 8, or maybe a little bit later, like 10, 11, 12, or later. And that's okay. It's, as I'm telling myself now as a parent, my kids are on different trajectories. And it's like, it's not a race, and it's a journey, and everyone's on their own journey. And I'm not as concerned about how old they are exactly. And the other thing that I'm thinking about that age that's special is 7, or actually exactly around 7 is when we encourage kids to kind of be a little bit more serious with their prayers. With the 5 daily prayers. And that's kind of more, I think, to inculcate like this idea of like, building habits. And if it's something that you do from a young age, then it'll be easier to stick with. It's harder sometimes to start something, as an adult. It's kind of we're trying to incorporate that from a young age, because it can be a challenge meaning praying 5 times a day. That can, that for me personally, that can be a challenge always to do them on time and to pray. And my husband will definitely agree with that because he kind of pokes fun at me about it. That's one of my personal challenges. But that's the age that we say that we want that we encourage kids to kind of start praying and taking it a little bit more seriously. So much so that sometimes even the 7th birthday, some people might not do like every birthday, but the 7th birthday, they'll make it a bigger deal and they'll call it like a prayer. Like this is the age when we're going to start, they'll give their child like their own prayer mat or the prayer beads, and kind of make it fun and make it a big deal. So I think that's interesting that it is something special about that age. And then also I was kind of thinking about, as we're talking about growing and how things change and the age of maturity, there's also another saying, as I mentioned, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are called hadith. There's a hadith that's very well known, and people reference this a lot. Especially every parenting talk that you go to that's hosted by a mosque, the speaker will mention this hadith, but I think it's really beautiful. Because actually what's interesting for us is that we have, like I mentioned, this collection of sayings and actions of the Prophet that we try to emulate. And there's actually a lot of examples of him being kind of a father and the family man, and kind of like how he helped out in the home and how he contributed and his relationship with his children. So this hadith is really quoted often and is very special. But basically, it's kind of talking about how we interact with children at different times. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Play with them for the first 7 years, then teach them for the next 7 years, and then advise them for the next 7 years after that." So it's almost like kind of dividing, the upbringing of a child into those 3 stages. And so which I think is really interesting, playing with them and we have so many studies even now that show, even when we're talking about dads, how important it is that dads are involved, and especially that physical play and, playing tag, hide and seek, tickling, how important that is for like that physical connection and, and kind of building those bonds, especially speaking of fathers, and as Father's Day is approaching. And I definitely see that with my my husband. He's very hands-on, and he, when they're babies, he's the one that's like throwing them up, it's freaking me out, throwing them up in the air a little too high. But he's very physical, playing tag, and my kids love it. And I'm probably kind of more the boring parent, but I'll play a card game or two if I'm in the mood. And then teaching them the next 7 years. So like first you're building that foundation of that relationship, the physical, the bonding, and then teaching them. And we know kids are sponges. And if you think about like kind of the stages, Erickson's stages of development, this is kind of like the school age, I guess you could say, maybe like 7 to 12 latency stage where, and actually I really love that. I love that stage, even when I see kids around that stage as a professional. And then now that I have teenagers, I'm enjoying my 2 little ones at that stage, that they want to be around you. They want to, they want to spend time with you, play with you, play games with you still, but do things with you, even just like reading together. You're still reading out loud kind of at that stage. They can read, they can read to themselves. That's another thing my husband does. Even when they're a little bit older, he loves reading with them at bedtime. And I used to be like, they need to read by themselves. Like we can't keep reading to them, but he really saw that actually as a very sacred time before bedtime, reading something. So we'll read like Harry Potter or something. And it's like kind of the last time where they kind of want to spend time with you and be with you. And very much in school, like the rule following and academics and achievement is so important, and mastery is so important. And then the last 7 years is advising them. So now they're kind of getting out in the world. They're kind of, now with my oldest, I'm seeing that this is the first time that he's kind of making friends. I don't really know his friends as I used to. I used to know all of his friends. I knew all the parents. I was really involved. Now he's kind of spreading his wings and he's meeting people that I don't necessarily know. And he's going to start, as kids his age, teenagers, as you mentioned, they start driving, they're going to start getting their first jobs. And so we just hope that, we just keep advising and giving them advice. And as you mentioned, there's this push and pull, like they'll act like they don't need you, but they very much do. And it's just kind of in a different way. And sometimes actually that's where technology can be helpful too, as I mentioned, kind of just this issue with the phone, but I think that's really interesting that seeing how parents and kids communicate, and sometimes you can communicate in a different way through text and through gifs and emojis. You can express yourself, and it's really funny to kind of see them expressing themselves and sharing little jokes and things, but then also kind of like an intimate thing too. Sometimes kids, it might be kind of uncomfortable for them to be like, I love you, but you can always kind of say in the text, and they appreciate that. So I kind of like that.
I do too, and I love that idea of the advice from your religious perspective, that there's 7 years, that it's divided into 3 intervals of 7 years. I would love to even explore that further. That's interesting. But what I want to get us into a little bit right now is the village. What is going on in the village? You and I probably are doing a pretty good job. I with my grandchildren, you with your children at home. But there's something going on right now in our society, in our village, that is that I think makes us wonder whether or not children are sacred to us, at least in terms of society. You are treating children as well as adults, but you are treating people who are maybe being more abandoned in society than we're willing to admit. And we were talking before we began to do the recording about the just abject sadness of thinking of those children in Uvalde, Texas, that we, and if that was an isolated incident, we might be able to say, okay, well, there's going to be crazy things that happen in this world, but there's a pattern to this. You were mentioning earlier that you were in your child's classroom and very aware of your fears. And, I think of my, grandchildren going off to their elementary school and thinking, are they safe? And I have some ability to do something, but I'm not sure what that is exactly. I know that I have a responsibility, maybe even a sacred responsibility to do something, but I seem to be coming up against other people who don't take that responsibility of protecting children from people who may be mentally ill or maybe making a political point. I'm not exactly clear on what's going on. I have some sense that maybe we are not generally, but in significant ways, abandoning young men, that young men are being left to figure things out for themselves and are not getting the kind of love and attention and a sense of sacredness that they deserve. How do you think about all of that? What do you think is going on, either from your faith perspective or from your professional perspective?
It's a very, it's a difficult question. And I don't know if any of us, of course, know the answers, but it kind of leaves me at an interesting intersection, I guess, too, because as a professional, mental health professional, as a psychiatrist, and as a minority, as a woman of color, and as a religious minority, ethnic minority, and as a parent, there's so many aspects to this. I guess the first thing is yes, I mean, just kind of that vulnerability. And there's been several times in the past, I would say decades, since my kids have kind of been in school now, where we, my husband and I, like, there'll be certain situations and events that we feel vulnerable, we feel powerless, we are scared to send our kids to school. Some of those times are during these school shootings. And, this hit us so close to home in on November 30th, 2021 in Oxford. And we have very dear friends that are in that community and in that school even. And that just the ripples that it created across the whole state, this whole region. I know many parents were worried about sending their kids to school. There was copycat threats. Our kids were anxious and scared. And even a few years ago, I remember that I had we've had parents, my kids actually until 8th grade, they go to parochial school. So they go to an Islamic school where they, of course, they have all their regular subjects, plus they have extra subjects too, just like other parochial schools, Christian or Catholic or Jewish schools. We have those as well here, many in the Southeast Michigan area. Where they have, a multitude of other subjects as well. And there was times actually with the last election with between the years of 2016 and 2020, where there was times where we really actually kind of felt that there was this, very loud voices that were kind of against any kind of minority. We felt that very loud and clear at times, unfortunately. And we know that that's not a majority by any means, but it was scary for a little bit. And there was times with sending our kids specifically to Islamic school felt very vulnerable too. And our kids safe here. There was a few days that I forgot exactly what it was in response to. I think maybe some threats again, like there was a pastor or somebody, not even, I wouldn't say a pastor, but somebody religious or with the religious kind of agenda that wanted to kind of come and shoot up a mosque or something like that in Dearborn. And many of the parents were very worried about sending their kids to particularly Islamic schools at that time. So I kind of feel, what I'm saying is like, I kind of feel it from different angles. And then as a mental health professional. So this is kind of usually the rhetoric that kind of comes up after school shootings, is this because mental illness, we're not treating the mentally ill. And what's interesting is actually I gave a talk to some psychiatry residents shortly after that, and I was kind of poring over kind of some studies and articles, although there's there's not a lot of funding actually for studying kind of like specifics, of gun violence, basically. A lot of that has been blocked by, lobbyists and with, certain, and I don't want to get into the legalities of all that, but But basically, kind of who do people tend to blame and kind of what is actually, at play here. And what we actually know is that honestly, people that have mental illness are much more likely to be victims of violence and gun violence than to be the perpetrators. So it's actually kind of not really fair or enough to kind of say that, or, is it kind of, are we kind of becoming, is this becoming like kind of a scapegoat? Is it, and the question is, and this is actually kind of a theoretical framework, is it dangerous people or dangerous weapons? And that kind of gets into a whole debate, but it kind of, there's a lot of questions that come up. I think the reason we jump to that is like, who in their right mind would do something like this? Who, especially children, right? You just cannot imagine that anybody that's thinking straight would do something like this. But it kind of comes down to how is mental illness defined, and how is the lay public kind of using these terms of mental illness? How do we define it in research? There's a difference between like what we call sociopathic behavior, antisocial behavior, criminal, kind of behavior versus like, we have to differentiate this from like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. If we're talking about, schizophrenia, particularly like more severe mental illness, again, they're more likely to be, and many studies have shown this, and we know that they're much more likely to be victims of gun violence or violence than to be the perpetrators. So, and there's a lot of papers on these kind of things. I'm kind of looking through some of things, but yeah, these are kind of questions on how do we define it. It's very easy. It's kind of like an easy headline, and we're kind of looking for an easy answer. And, maybe, and sometimes we're kind of thwarting it in a certain direction. So we don't, that could be on purpose so that we're not kind of addressing kind of like the real questions and real pushback that maybe is needed to change policy and to sway lawmakers and things like that, which is actually a bipartisan issue, and then we also know it's the issue of gun control, or even, it's a very heated discussion. But as I was kind of preparing for that talk, it was really interesting. There's been so many proposals for things. No one is actually saying to take guns away, but if we're talking about military style assault weapons, and we're talking about like, hey, let's have some just rules that make sense. You should not be able to get a gun like just willy-nilly when you feel like it. Background checks. And then also there's solutions that have kind of been proposed, and there's some states actually that have kind of adopted these some of these rules, common sense kind of gun policies. And the other one, kind of a big one, is I'm kind of trying to find I want to give the term for it. Where is it? Basically the there's a specific term, and I know we're like gonna be recorded, but extreme risk protection orders, basically enabling family, law enforcement, kind of to make a case that maybe this individual is not a good time for them to have a gun. And then actually that individual has an opportunity to kind of present their own case and present evidence. And then the judge is kind of ruling. It doesn't mean that they will never get it back, but like it's a temporary kind of order that they are not allowed to have like their weapon. But I mean, it's really difficult. These questions are really difficult because so much of it is kind of it's a type of cultural competence too. It's kind of part of especially some areas in the United States, it's kind of part of the culture. And there was another article that I read that I thought was really interesting. We talk about cultural competence in all fields, and in medicine, it's really important because as physicians, we are encouraging people, we're prescribing medications, we're prescribing treatments, we're encouraging therapy. And cultural competence is just at the core of that, because if there's no trust, and if people don't feel that they're being heard, and that you don't understand where they're coming from, they're much less likely to kind of follow through. They'll say, oh, okay, doctor, yes, I'm going to do that. But then they don't really trust you. They're not going to do it. And we know that. And it was interesting that there was this discussion about having cultural competence when we're even talking about these kind of things too, because when we use these terms and these loaded terms and words like gun control and rights and Second Amendment, like people get really figuratively and literally kind of up in arms about that, very defensive, and because it's part of a culture too, and we do have to kind of realize that, and not necessarily place blame or make it a black and white, like you're a bad person if you believe this. It's kind of goes back to how things were actually with the last election cycle. But use those same concepts of cultural competence to kind of come to maybe try to have these discussions so people don't get so defensive, maybe. I don't know.
Yes. And another podcast, we might talk about one of the projects of the Interfaith Leadership Council to deal with that, to get people to get beyond their defenses. But for our discussion right now, we really are only have a few minutes left. I want to mention the concept of idols. Both of our faiths are adamant about not having idols, and to pay attention to the one God. We have different, names for it. Allah, in Arabic, and God in English, but they're the same God, and I think that the idea of not having, not worshiping a false God is the idea that there are some things that we can seem to be putting our trust in that do not have God in them, that do not have a God, an expression of God. Our children can be sacred to us and wonderful, and we pay attention to them, and they can't possibly be an idol, not in the sense I'm talking about right now. Whereas a weapon can be. A weapon can be clearly an idol. If you take and give the importance to a weapon beyond the importance of a child, you've made in my understanding of what it means to have idols in your life, you've made those weapons an idol. You have said that somehow something that inanimate, that really doesn't have the God force in it, is more important than the dangers that weapon presents to our society. And we have, without having to go into the history of not having easy access to military weapons, we do have an experience in America where making it difficult to get a hold of those weapons makes a huge difference. And so, I just wonder if we're really applying our faith carefully, if we've allowed ourselves to become enamored with an idol. I've suggested to another psychiatrist friend of mine that adolescent gunplay fantasies play a part in some of this. And I'm not saying that everyone who experiences the desire to have a gun and play with it is necessarily going to go in and shoot up a school, but there's some significant number we now know that are imagining themselves as powerful when they have that weapon in their hands, and having solved the problem of their feeling inadequate in some way, which is the norm of adolescence. And and then how many people have committed suicide because they've had easy access to guns, especially men. Men seem to use that method for suicide much more often than women statistically. What about the death of children when guns are not stored safely? It's more likely that a child is going to die from a gun that's not stored safely than it is likely that someone will be an intruder in your home, and that you will need that weapon for that. So it just seems to me that our religious understandings give us some sense of how we should make a priority and to be careful about by being enamored with idols, things that are not as sacred as our children should be to us. That feeling on my part is really quite strong, and I'm not sure. I know I don't share that with every Christian. I think there's plenty of Christians who disagree with me on that, but that's the place I come from, is that if we really think our children are sacred, then I can't imagine a way of assigning sacredness to an automatic weapon that is murderous. And I'm personally would like people to gather an image of what it looks like to have used a weapon like that on babies. And I'm not sure that it's the only area. I'd like, maybe as we take one or two more minutes here, you might talk about the idea of access to mental health by, not all people are stable enough, that is, parents are not all stable enough to give the kind of advice that their children desperately need. And it's hard to get access to mental health services. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, as I kind of mentioned, that sometimes the conversation does shift to that, right? To talking about access to mental health, and if kind of what I was saying just a few minutes ago, if that does lead to better access and better, allowing people to be able to utilize mental health services, then that's a good thing too. So then, okay, yeah, and I don't disagree with that, definitely. We don't want to kind of point the finger and say everyone that does this is mentally ill, but at the same time, I definitely totally agree with you. Actually, one of the biggest things in our training is dealing with people with individuals with depression or with other, that have suicidal thoughts. And one of the first things we do is ask about having a gun, access to a gun. And we know that removing a gun temporarily, like drastically reduces the chances of suicide by a weapon. So it definitely can be a challenge. And I think it's not that the help is not there, but it's, oftentimes, it can be the first area where resources are taken away. We know that. There was a huge, just with the deinstitutionalization of so many people, with the state hospitals closing a few decades ago, we're still feeling the ramifications of that. And there's some wonderful agencies, there's some wonderful places, even here in the Metro Detroit area that very much their whole mission is to take care of children and families. I'm thinking of like the Children's Center, so many places, and I've met so many people that are really passionate about this work and specifically want to go into mental health to help families, to help children, help couples, help adults, deal with substance issues, mental illness, all these things. So there's a lot of really good people that are kind of going in the field, and it's just, it's kind of one step at a time. I feel like in many ways, there is still stigma, but even compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I think it's becoming more normal to say that you're seeing somebody, you're seeing a therapist, you're getting help. I know that these conversations are happening much more often in our religious spaces. We have the imams regularly infuse in their like Friday sermons, when these things happen, they regularly talk about the importance of getting professional help. There's a religious aspect, and then there's also the aspect of going to somebody that knows more, and that's religiously, that's okay. I feel like I'm hoping, and maybe I'm just seeing a skewed sample, but that there's less shame in getting help. So it's access, but then there was a huge thing with stigma, especially in minority communities and immigrant communities. And I think slowly but surely it's getting better. And the more we are talking about it, then the better we'll get. I always say, like, if we can get to the point where we're talking about going to a therapist as easily and from the tongue as like, oh, I'm going to go to a haircut, or I'm going to as if you're saying I'm going to go to get a haircut in the same breath, to say, and then I have to go to therapy, then I think we're kind of moving in the right direction, because we're normalizing it. And I've been in a room where someone has said that when they're like at a lectern and giving a lecture, and they're talking really openly about getting help and how much that helped them and what they gain from that. And it just helps everybody in the room to hear that, to hear somebody that they respect being very open about getting help. Of course, that takes a special person, and everyone has a right to their privacy. But again, that really does a lot to kind of fight that stigma and the shame.
Well, what I would hope that might come out of our discussion and other discussions like it would be that we wouldn't just offhandedly talk about our children being sacred, or even that they are a sacred responsibility. I think we who have faith values, people who have a focus on humanism, that humanity is special in some way. We don't have to all agree religiously on what that means, but I think we can all agree that humanity is special in some way, and that if we're going to talk about these innocent children that are given into our care as sacred in any way, we need to actualize that idea somehow. We need to define what it means to say that something is sacred, and then do something that makes us feel that sacredness is there, that we've taken that responsibility seriously. You had mentioned earlier the poem by Khalil Gibran, and I think it's a beautiful way to end our discussion this evening, or this today. So if you would just maybe give us that poem. What else would you like to introduce it in some way and present it?
No, thank you. No, that's perfect. Yeah, this is a poem that I read a long time ago. And when we were talking about speaking and this whole topic and sacredness of children, it was kind of the first thing that kind of popped in my mind. So I thought I would share. And many of you, I'm sure, have read this poem or heard it in some way. But Khalil Gibran on children. And a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable.
That is such a wonderful way to end, and I've really enjoyed this discussion with you, Dr. Maroof. I hope that our listeners find it as interesting as I have, and I would look forward to having other discussions with you. It's been a very, very wonderful experience. So thank you for being willing to come on to this podcast and to talk about the sacredness of our children.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you for inviting me, and it's really been an honor. Thank you.
Well, it's been a mutual honor. Thank you.